Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get ready because today we're diving headfirst into a real turning point in history. The Potsdam Conference, July 1945.
A pivotal moment indeed.
You've really outdone yourself this time. You sent over a whole sack of stuff about this conference. There's a history podcast in there, a bunch of quotes from the actual people who were there. It's amazing.
I think you'll find it fascinating to see this event from so many angles.
You always find the best stuff. I'm excited to dig in with you.
It's a period when the world was holding its breath, recovering from war, but also kind of teetering on the edge of a whole new kind of conflict. It makes every conversation, every decision feel incredibly significant.
And on top of all that, you've got the major players on the world stage literally changing mid-game. It's like the ultimate plot twist.
It really is.
We're talking about the big three, right? The U.S., the UK, and the Soviet Union. They're all there trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. But something feels different this time. Like the energy's off compared to their meetings during the war.
Yeah. Off might be putting it mildly. Roosevelt's death just a few months before Potsdam cast a huge shadow over everything.
It's hard to imagine the Allies without him.
Right, and then Truman steps in, and he's a different animal altogether. He's way more suspicious of Stalin than Roosevelt ever was, which changes the entire dynamic.
And if that wasn't enough of a shakeup, you've got Churchill, the bulldog himself, getting booted right in the middle of the conference.
Oh yeah, the timing couldn't have been worse.
That's how they put it in this history podcast you sent over. They literally said he got the boot.
And in walks Clement Attlee like, hello, everyone.
Can you imagine being a fly on the wall in that room? Churchill's party loses the election back home, and suddenly he's out, and this new guy, Attlee, is thrown into the deep end. The mood must have shifted dramatically.
I can't even imagine what those guys were thinking. They had relied so heavily on those personal relationships, especially during the war. It was like someone hit the reset button on their entire alliance.
So with all of this political drama swirling around, what were they even trying to achieve at Potsdam? What was the main agenda item?
Well, the biggest issue, of course, was what to do about Germany.
Makes sense. They had just defeated the Nazis.
Right, and by this point, the Allies had already agreed to demilitarize Germany and divide it into 4 zones of occupation. The US, the USSR, the UK, and France each got a piece of the pie.
Sounds straightforward enough, I guess.
It sounds simple on the surface, but, well...
There's always a but, isn't there?
There's always a but in history. This podcast really digs into this. From what I gather, reparations were a huge sticking point.
Reparations, you mean making Germany pay for the war?
Exactly. The Soviets had been absolutely devastated by the German invasion. Think about it. Entire cities were in ruins, millions of people dead. They wanted Germany to pay for what they had done, and rightfully so.
I can't imagine arguing with that.
But the US and the UK found themselves in a very tricky position. They were walking a tightrope, trying to balance punishing Germany with making sure they didn't make the same mistakes they'd made after World War I.
You're talking about the Treaty of Versailles.
Exactly. Punishing Germany too harshly after World War I had backfired spectacularly.
How so?
Well, it created a lot of resentment among the German people, which led to economic instability and ultimately created fertile ground for extremist movements like the Nazis. No one wanted to see that happen again.
So how do you even begin to resolve a standoff like that? Did they manage to find some kind of middle ground on reparations, or was it just a recipe for disaster?
They did eventually reach a kind of compromise, but it was definitely uneasy, let's put it that way.
I bet.
The Soviets agreed to accept 25% of the reparations from the Western occupation zones, which were the industrial heartland of Germany at that time. But in exchange, the Soviets had to provide food and raw materials from their occupation zone, which was more agricultural.
So it's kind of like a trade-off.
In a way, yes. And it's really interesting to look back on now because you can see how this economic arrangement, even back then, becomes this microcosm of the entire Cold War that's about to unfold.
It's like they were setting the stage without even realizing it.
Precisely.
This podcast actually does a great job of highlighting the different ways historians have interpreted what happened at Potsdam. Like some historians, the traditionalists, see it as clear evidence that Stalin was all about expanding Soviet power. They argue that he was using the war as an excuse to grab as much territory and influence as possible.
Which is a very popular interpretation.
Right. But then you got the revisionists pushing back against that view.
It gets heated.
They say that it was actually the U.S. and its atomic bomb, along with its economic policies, that really drove the conflict. They argue that the Soviets were simply reacting to what they perceived as a threat from the West.
A classic case of whose side are you on?
Exactly. And of course, you can't have a good historical debate without some middle ground. The post-revisionists come in and say, hey, maybe both sides were motivated by mistrust and fear. Maybe everyone was just trying to protect themselves, and it spiraled out of control from there.
It's the everyone sucks school of history.
And then you've got the realists who take a more, shall we say, cynical view of things. They basically say that the Cold War was inevitable. They argue that the power vacuum left by World War II was just too tempting for either side to resist. Someone was bound to try to fill it.
Which makes you wonder, does any of it even matter? If it was all going to happen anyway.
That's a bit bleak, isn't it? It's amazing how the same set of events can be interpreted in so many radically different ways. It's like looking into one of those distorted mirrors at a carnival.
Speaking of distorted reflections, we should probably talk about Poland.
What about it?
Well, their fate at Potsdam was a particularly complicated and messy affair. You see, the previous agreement at Yalta, that agreement basically handed control of Eastern Poland over to the Soviets, and it was something that Truman was really absolutely, but short of a full-blown military confrontation with the Soviets, which no one wanted, their options were really limited. It put them in a tough spot.
That's some seriously heavy stuff. It really sounds like this whole conference was overshadowed by this sense of limited options. And speaking of heavy stuff, literally it's time to talk about the elephant in the room. Or maybe the mushroom cloud in the room.
Ah, yes. The atomic bomb.
You can't avoid it forever.
We can't. And talk about a game changer. Right in the middle of this already tense conference, Truman gets word that the first atomic bomb test, the Trinity test in New Mexico, had been successful.
Wow. Can you imagine getting that news? The weight of that knowledge, especially in that context, it completely changes the global power dynamic in an instant. But he can't just blurt it out, can he? How did he even play that? What did he say to Stalin?
From what we can tell from the transcripts you dug up, Truman actually played it incredibly cool. He mentioned it to Stalin, but in a very casual, almost offhand way.
Like, oh, by the way.
Right. He said something to the effect of the U.S. now possessing a new weapon of unusual destructive force.
Okay, so not exactly a full disclosure.
Not even close. It was more like, hey, Stalin, just so you know, we've got something big now, but I'm not going to tell you what it is.
And I bet Stalin just loved that.
Well, historians still debate Truman's motives for keeping it so vague. Some argue that he was trying to use it as leverage, like a way to pressure the Soviets without explicitly threatening them.
Subtly reminding them who's boss, maybe.
Exactly. But then there's the other side of the coin. This podcast you sent argues that Truman's secrecy actually backfired because it just fueled Soviet paranoia even more, pushing them to ramp up their own atomic program as quickly as possible.
Which, in hindsight, isn't great.
Not ideal. And that's the question that continues to fascinate historians. Did Truman's secrecy actually accelerate the arms race? Because if so, that's a pretty chilling thought.
It's like this dark cloud hanging over what was supposed to be a conference about rebuilding and creating a lasting peace.
It is. But it's important to remember that even with all this tension, all the suspicion and posturing, there were a few glimmers of hope that emerged from Potsdam.
You're talking about the United Nations.
I am. Potsdam was where they really hammered out the final details for the UN, which had been in the works for a while.
So they're literally building a global organization right there at the same time as all of this tension about the atomic bomb. It's like they're having two completely different conversations at the same time.
It is a strange juxtaposition when you think about it. You have this incredibly hopeful project about the formation of the UN Security Council with its permanent members and the veto power, all designed to prevent another world war. But at the same time, there's this underlying sense of distrust that's impossible to ignore.
I can see that. Like, they're trying to create a system based on trust, but can they really trust each other at this point?
Yeah.
Especially with this new weapon looming over everything.
And speaking of that distrust, you sent over this quote from Clement Attlee, the guy who replaced Churchill mid-conference. He said something like, "We must not allow any one power to dominate Europe again. Poland must be free, but how we achieve that remains difficult under present conditions."
Yes, that's a concern.
He was definitely walking a tightrope with that statement. You can hear the hope in his words for a just and lasting peace, but also this acknowledgement that with the Red Army right there in Eastern Europe, true freedom for Poland was, well, A complicated issue, to say the least.
Because they're trying to build a house on a foundation that's already full of cracks, you know what I mean?
That's a great analogy. And of course, hovering over all of this, even if it's not being explicitly said, is the atomic bomb.
Right, like everyone knows it's there, even if they're not talking about it directly.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how much that unspoken threat influenced the negotiations. I was reading this one account, and it mentioned that when Truman casually mentioned the bomb to Stalin,
Naturally, yeah, right.
it said that Stalin seemed almost indifferent to the news.
Oh, I think he was freaking out on the inside, though.
Right. Trying to keep a poker face while his mind is racing a million miles an hour.
I mean, wouldn't you?
Of course. And we know from historical records that as soon as he got back to Moscow, Stalin ordered his scientists to accelerate the Soviet nuclear program. He may not have shown it at Potsdam, but he knew that the game had fundamentally changed.
Yeah, it's like this invisible force shaping everything that happens from that moment forward.
Like a ghost at the banquet, you know? This invisible presence that changes the whole atmosphere without ever saying a word.
Ooh, I like that. A ghost at the banquet. And I think that image really captures the strange legacy of the Potsdam Conference. It's easy to look at it now and see it as a failure, like a missed opportunity to create a truly unified world after the horrors of World War II. But then again, there were successes too.
Absolutely. I mean, for all its flaws, the creation of the UN was a huge deal. It was a real tangible step towards greater global cooperation, and it's still around today.
So it's a mixed bag, I guess. A lot of tension and uncertainty, but also these glimmers of hope poking through.
It's a good reminder that even when things seem really bleak, even when you're dealing with people you deeply distrust, there's always a chance for dialogue. There's always a chance that you can find some common ground.
Well said. Well, there you have it, folks. Another deep dive into the history books complete. This time, it was a Potsdam Conference, a story of power shifts, uneasy alliances, and the dawn of the atomic age.
A pivotal moment that, in many ways, continues to shape our world today.
That's the thing about history, isn't it? It's never really over. It's always there, right under the surface, influencing everything we do.
Exactly. And it's up to us to learn from it, to try to understand the choices that were made and why, so that we can hopefully make better choices in the present.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the past. You never know what you might find.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.